to share a little bit of the research and work and curriculum that we've been sharing with thousands of teachers across Monroe County, the ways we've been working to digitize some of this material to make sure it's accessible, and the ways we've used the Digital Humanities to create resources that can be used in classrooms, grades 2 through 12, to help tell the local history of racist policy and resistance, from enslavement to redlining, to local civil rights, to present inequity and justice movements. Our team is really committed to helping schools, colleges, and really anyone in the community understand our history, particularly of racist policy, the stories of resistance, that we might all come together in working more towards equity and justice in our community. The project, the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project, we are hosted by Pat Stone, and it's led by Keisha James and myself. And an amazing team of teachers here helps write, curate, and facilitate curriculum and professional development. I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about some of this Rochester history in a lecture format, a little bit different than how we often will do it with teachers, but hopefully I'll be able to give you a really good overview of some local history of racist policy and those who have fought back in our community, that we might move forward in doing some of those things today. And so as I dive in, I'll tell you a little bit more about our team and some of our work. Everything that you see today has been vetted by community elders who are active participants in Rochester's civil rights movement, from Dr. Walter Cooper to Dr. Alice Holloway Young, to over 30 youth who work at Teen Empowerment. We've been able to pay them to help write and vet curriculum and choose sources and help decide what you see today in this presentation. The stories about their neighborhoods that are important to them are represented here. Another thing to share with you, we've got curriculum in a number of different grade levels on the Black freedom struggle, Latinx civil rights in Rochester, enslavement, redlining, civic action. In the chat, I shared links to all of our curriculum. It's all free, it's all open source, and soon it will be published on an amazing website, Resistance Mapping, that we'll be talking more about at the end, that will also have access to these resources and some really interactive ways to engage with our history and our present in Rochester, from kids to adults. We're really excited about some of it. A little bit more about our model. It's rooted in restorative practices, inquiry, civic action, New York State social studies, and culture responsive frameworks, and in building capacity at schools and on teams. The most important piece, though, for tonight is really this inquiry. I want to invite you to put your student hat on, to get your notices, your wonders, and your inferences all warmed up, to think about as I'm sharing, if what I'm sharing is credible, if what I'm sharing fits with the context that you know, the main idea, thinking about whose voices might be missing. This won't be exhaustive. I really hope, though, that you'll have some really great questions, that you'll think critically about what I'm sharing, just like we invite students and teachers across the county to do. And I'll dive right in. Again, I shared this in the chat right here, a link to all of our resources and the databases that I'm going to be referencing today, and how you can get in touch, as well as all of our curriculum and a conference that's coming up. All right, to kind of start us off, I just want to start with some group norms. These are part of restorative practices. When we talk about difficult conversations like around race, around equity and inequity, it's really important that, I don't know, we talk a little bit about how to have these conversations in a better, safe, and empowering way with students and adults. I always invite folks to speak the truth using I statements, to stay engaged. Expect to be a little uncomfortable. We're going to talk about some hard facts about our community. Be aware of your intent and on the impact of your words. Accept and accept non-closure. Maintain a learner stance. Be curious. Be respectful. And that's kind of where we're going to go today, in terms of especially our conversation at the end and the sharing that we do in the chat. And I don't know, it's our hope that we have a really great conversation and some really great learning. I want to start with some level setting, though, around language or definitions. That'll also give you a little look at some local history. The first is this word anti-racist. We like to think of it as an adjective to help us be able to be specific in describing beliefs or actions. Anti-racist means you're demonstrating action that shows belief or action as if racial groups are equals, and there's an active resistance of racism. So here's Austin Stewart. He was enslaved right here near Rochester, New York. He escaped along Canandaigua Lake as a freedom seeker. eventually opened the first Black-owned business in Rochester, a spot on the Underground Railroad, the first school that Black children were legally allowed to attend in our area. And in those moments of resistance, of seeking freedom on the Underground Railroad, he was demonstrating anti-racist action. And I think you'll see a lot of folks in this presentation today who took specific action to move the needle when it comes to inequity. On the opposite side of that is this term racist, thinking again as an adjective. I'm not telling you that to think that Nathaniel Rochester, the founder of our community, is a racist, but I would argue that he demonstrated racist actions when he enslaved Black people, both in the South, and forced them to work for no pay, bought and sold them to make money, even brought enslaved people right here to Rochester to work his land. In those moments, he showed belief and action that he thought something was wrong or inferior about people of different racial groups than himself. Very recently, you might have seen a Democrat and Chronicle article yesterday published with new information about this guy right here that documents that he was actually a sheriff down in Maryland before coming to Rochester. And he was actively involved in hunting down freedom seekers, arresting them, and then selling them from the jail, which was new information in the Rochester area and something that you can see on the Freedom in the Move database that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Also a racist policy, any measure that produces or sustains inequity between racial groups. These could be written, unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, guidelines that govern people. For example, in New York State, enslavement was legal. It was the law. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was something that was voted on and happened here. Over half of our New York State senators and assembly members were enslavers and helped enforce some of these policies. You can see that I found this on the Northeast Slavery Records Index, which has really pretty exhaustive documentation of the slavery records for New York State. And then also the website Freedom on the Move that has tons of newspaper advertisements for people who are seeking their freedom. And this was what that DNC article was about yesterday. Nathaniel Rochester, Sheriff of Washington County, Maryland. And you can see him putting out these advertisements for people that he had captured and saying that they will be sold agreeably to the benefit of the law if they are not claimed. Which leads us to this final description to kind of help you center yourself and think a little bit about some of the examples in the talk today. Dr. Beverly Tatum helps us visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. People demonstrating racist actions, taking those active steps towards inequity, very much on board with it. Whereas the passively racist person is standing still, they're trying to be nice, but not really doing anything to create change. And they're ending up in the same place as this person. I think that's been me for a lot of my life. Whereas a person who's anti-racist turns in the opposite direction and demonstrates actions and beliefs that work towards equity and justice. And that's our hope, that as we explore some of these stories from our past and present, we might take some of those steps as well. And it's going to be needed because in our area in New York State, we have the most segregated schools in the entire country. In fact, the border between the town of Penfield and Rochester is the single most segregating school district border in all 50 states. The border between Brighton schools and the city schools is number 6 in the country for segregation, and Irondequoit is number 7, again, for race and class, number 1 most segregated. When you take a look at our community, the census data, using this racial dot map, you can see our suburbs are predominantly white, our inner city is predominantly Black and Hispanic, and highways and barriers are in place, separating different racial groups and communities. There are some issues. The Hard Facts report going through 2020 census data found that there are significant inequities in almost all metrics, from ELA to household income to child poverty, general poverty. Home ownership rates between Black and white is more than double the home ownership for white families in our community than white. Even with things like the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that outlawed practices like redlining that we'll explore in a minute, the gap between home ownership nationally between white and Black has only ever continued to widen, and that has stayed the same here in our community, including when it comes to home value. And the Act Rochester database, if you just Google Act Rochester, it is incredible in terms of finding up-to-date specific data about what's happening in our community, especially related to inequity. And we spend a lot of time with our students digging into some of this. So I want to center us with kind of the thesis or general message of our talk. Now that I've gotten some language out of the way and a little bit of background, The goal of this talk today is to live out these words from the great James Baldwin. He writes that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And it's my hope that you'll join me today in having some of that courage that James Baldwin talks about in facing the inequity and its root causes in our community head on, and being able to see a little bit of some of the databases and ways some of this pieces and data have been pulled together from my digital humanities friends out there. And here's the thing. People of color in our community have always named racism for what it was. They've always called it out, and they've always taken action against it, from enslavement with Austin Stewart to people like Howard Coles with a New Deal in the 1930s. Howard Coles is a hero of the Rochester community. In the 1930s, he started the Frederick Douglass Voice, Rochester's only Black newspaper at the time. It was in the Red Line, Clarissa Street neighborhood. He was head of the NAACP. In his paper, which he published on a weekly basis, he documented stories of discrimination and action, especially when redlining began in our community. He called it out in the pages of his paper when the Democrat and Chronicle was publicly endorsing these racist housing policies and racial covenants. Coles was naming it, calling it racist, and saying this needed to change, and trying to organize the Black community and white allies in defense or to fight back against some of these policies. He found in his reporting and in his study of how this was playing out that people of color were being forced to live in just two neighborhoods of Rochester, the 3rd Ward, or Clarissa Street, Cornhill neighborhood, right across from the U of R, and the 7th Ward, which many know is that Joseph, Hudson, Clinton, Baden, Ormond area of the city that kind of butts up against the public market. He found that if you moved here and you were Black, you were forced to live in those neighborhoods, that over 30% of these homes didn't have running water. And a lot of this is publicized on the Rochester Voices Project, which is now a virtual database that is documenting some of his newspapers. And then there's the old-fashioned database, which is just boxes and boxes and boxes at the Rochester Museum and Science Center. And I had the incredible privilege of going through those with their librarian and the youth at Teen Empowerment and Howard Coles' daughter, Joan Coles, who helped edit the newspaper with him. If you're a nerd like me, you want to dig into some old documents, there is nothing better than going to the Rochester Museum and Science Center and taking a look at these newspapers from the 30s up to the late 80s that are just incredible. You can see the database right here. And I've linked to this in the link that I shared in the chat, which I can share again in a little bit if you came in just a minute late. But you can look through a number of these different newspapers. It's just incredible. Next, I want to talk about Charles Body. Almost 10 years after Coles starts calling out redlining, Body does the same in the Democrat and Chronicle. Again, found in the newspapers.com archive. Pastor of Mount Olivet, he describes the housing situation as an enigma for Black people, saying in Rochester, only 2 areas have been gracefully made available, still 10 years after Coles calling it out, saying that if any attempt is made to move out of these Black ghettos, the attempt is met with opposition. And tonight we're going to talk about that opposition, some of the specific forms of opposition, both locally, state, and nationally. And what's most important here is the way the national law, the federal government, the New Deal, actually codified some of these racist policies that were already happening in the Rochester community and across the country in something called the National Housing Act of 1934. To give you some context, this is the wake of the Great Depression. Eugenics is on the rise. This is a time when it's really difficult to buy a home. There's no such thing as an FHA or VA loan. Homeownership rates are incredibly low. Majority of Americans are renters at this period of time. So FDR from New York State, former governor, is now president, and he signs into law this bill that ends up giving out over $119 billion in federal mortgage subsidies to help certain people build, purchase, and improve homes, particularly in neighborhoods that were seen as safe and in suburbs all across the country. This is what builds our country's suburbs and towns like Penfield that are the most segregated school districts in the country today. And part of the reason for that is written into this law. It was explicit that this was not really for Black folks or people of color, for Asian, for Latinx folks. It said explicitly that if a neighborhood is to attain stability, its necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. It goes on to say any change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in value. Goes on to say that deed restrictions should be put on all land in the immediate environment of a location if it's going to receive federal investment or funds. Deed restrictions prohibiting the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended are a must if you're going to receive that kind of incentive, even going so far as to say highways or high-speed traffic arteries should be put in place to separate inharmonious racial groups, and that the government is more likely to invest in a neighborhood if it is protected by a highway. For example, Rochester's downtown or Park Ave neighborhoods, East Ave neighborhoods are so-called protected by the construction of the inner loop separating those communities from Black communities in Rochester. Even going farther, they talk about schools, saying the social class of parents of children at a school will have a direct bearing, saying if the physical surroundings of a neighborhood are favorable and conducive to enjoyable, pleasant living in its location, it's not enough. If the children of people living in the area are compelled to attend school where the majority or considerable number of pupils represent a far level lower of society or an incompatible racial element, the neighborhood under consideration will prove less stable and desirable than if this condition did not exist. So segregation being implemented in a national way. So often we think of it as just something in the South, but this was a national policy and had bearing on what neighborhoods were rated well for federal investment here in Rochester. Just one of the ways this massive housing policy was enforced was through the construction of these residential security maps or redlining maps that helped enforce who and where these funds were given and which neighborhoods would be Black and white neighborhoods in communities all across the country. Neighborhoods were rated green and blue if they were 100% white, middle, and upper middle class. Yellow neighborhoods meant declining, but still almost entirely 100% white, maybe older homes, maybe more immigrant families at that time would be in those neighborhoods. For example, where I live in Beechwood, it was red and yellow. And in part, it was yellow lined here because it was around 30% Italian. And that was seen as undesirable. Remember, the 1930s is the time of eugenics. You've got people like George Eastman, one of the biggest funders of the American Eugenics Society. Eastman School of Music is doing eugenic studies about this pseudo-race science. You're seeing these kinds of things at Cornell, all over the place. I mean, the University of Rochester would not accept Black nursing or medical candidates into its medical school in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So what the federal government's doing is codifying something that was already kind of the norm, but now financially incentivizing it. So in the Mapping Inequality resource at the University of Richmond, Dale Whiting and his team have done some really amazing work. You can actually click on almost any neighborhood in any city, and you can see the actual reports and how it was rated and why it was rated so. So here's Clarissa Street or Cornhill, a neighborhood that Common Ground Health says the children born there today are expected to live 9 years less than in the green-lined community of Pittsburgh here in Rochester. Notice this neighborhood was deemed hazardous or red because it was 75% Black and 10% foreign or Italian, and it was filled with laborers and workers with lower incomes. Compare that to Northwest Irondequoit, 0% Black, 0% foreign, white collar professional men. Notice they get to be called men, whereas in a red line neighborhood like the 7th Ward, it was 40% Jewish and Italian, 10% Black, workers, therefore hazardous. Important to note too, that women did not have access to home ownership at this time unless they sort of inherited through their husbands. It was like late 60s, early 70s, I think, that women could actually legally get an FHA loan from the federal government. And all this is incredibly well detailed and organized in the American Panorama website, particularly in Mapping Inequality. I'll show you a few of these as we go throughout the presentation tonight. But if you go to this Mapping Inequality project, or the American Panorama, which again is linked in that document, you can see that almost every state has these maps. You can zoom into these different areas. You can take a look, you zoom in closely. If anyone here is like from the Syracuse area, maybe some folks are familiar with like where I-81 is, the highway. It was built right here because this was literally called the Black section of town. And across the street was the Italian section. You can see the Black section was rated because of that and because of the Latinx folks that lived in the neighborhood. Just some really wild stuff. You can click on really any city and dig into some of this. You can zoom back out. It's pretty fascinating, the different things that you can do. You can even take a look at health outcomes by neighborhood. There were a study that recently came out from the National Reinvestment Coalition that took this data and built in years per life lost based on neighborhood. And people in Rochester who currently live in Green Line neighborhoods are expected to live 5 years longer than people who currently live in Red Lines neighborhoods. So some pretty staggering data that they've done an amazing job documenting. And depending on the school we're working with, we always kind of change out our sources to highlight the neighborhoods of those schools and those children's communities. Meanwhile, all of Rochester's suburbs were Green Line, meaning that if you were white, you could get a 30-year FHA mortgage that was heavily subsidized by the federal government to buy and improve your home. My grandfather in 1952 bought his house in Greece. The government gave him money to help him do that. He used that home to buy a bigger home, to invest the equity from that home into his business, to build wealth that he used then to send my parents to college. He helped send me to college. I have no debt. I own my own home. I'm a teacher with a master's degree, in part because of the benefits of that incredible generational wealth. So to help you understand some scale, just how much an impact this federal policy had on Rochester, by 1960, there were just 11 individual people of color in Henrietta, according to the DNC. This was Rochester's most integrated suburb in 1960. It was led by Dr. Walter and Helen Cooper, who were executives over at Kodak and scientists, some of like 5 Black employees at Kodak at the time. They forced their way into Henrietta. Dr. Cooper, who's an advisor and board member of our project, has talked a lot to our team about how he didn't want to live in Henrietta. It was just the least developed, and the white folks were the least organized in Henrietta. Remember, the highways didn't go out there at that time in 1958 when they integrated it. And so they made their way in. They found an ally in the real estate business who was willing to kind of pull some corners and sneak them into town. A few other friends from the NAACP joined them, moving in solidarity to be able to resist some of this stuff. What's really cool here is part of how I ended up befriending Dr. Cooper, and so many of the folks that you'll see in this presentation were finding them in the Rochester Voices Project at the public library, or finding articles about some of these folks in newspapers.com. And then from there, starting to find, where are these folks, and asking them out to lunch, then for dinner, and asking if we can learn more about this. Would they come into my classroom and tell more of their stories? And Dr. Cooper is one of those people who is still fighting for racial justice today. He was active in the NAACP. He was the founder of Action for a Better Community in the Urban League here in Rochester, and continues to just do incredible work, especially for the students at his school, school number 10, the Walter Cooper Academy here in RCSD. Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, gives us even more scope and scale though. So you can see this was really happening in Rochester, but nationwide, he found that the FHA and VA insured half of all new mortgages nationwide, giving out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance to white families. Here you'll see a giant bulldozer with our FHA underwriting manual dude, Alfred Gertis, who kind of oversaw the implementation of these loans into these whites-only spaces. This is 1947. Some of these funds were used for public housing for veterans. It's really interesting to note, though, that in the 40s and early 50s, Black veterans of World War II did not have access to public housing. It was reserved only for white people in our community. In the Howard Coles Archives, Rush Museum and Science Center, there are letters documenting Black veterans who met all requirements, who Howard Coles helped apply, and Gertis and another man named Elmer Milliman, the president of Central Trust Bank, who oversaw a lot of this, their replies that, nope, they are not accepting these candidates at this time based on the color of their skins. Richard Rothstein tells us even more scale, that over 35 million families nationwide during the 30s through 60s benefited from these FHA and VA-backed loans. And like my family, 98% of them were white. You can see Foxwell, the president of ES&L Bank, giving out that first GI loan in New York State in 1944. The first Black person to get a loan from ESL Bank was Dr. Walter Cooper in 1958, and only because of his high level and influence at Kodak and influence with the NAACP. Now, I want to make this story a little bit more personal when it comes to redlining. So here's Dr. Alice Holloway Young. She wanted to buy a house. She and her husband, James, wanted more space for their children to play in. She has her PhD. She's the first Black principal in Monroe County, one of the founding trustees of Monroe Community College. Dr. Young is a living legend. School number 3 was just named after her. And in 1957, she tried to buy a house in the 19th ward. She went to the banks in town. Not a single one would pre-approve her for a mortgage because of redlining and color of her skin. Not a single real estate agent would show her a home in the 19th ward. So she reached out to her friend, Mrs. Harper Sibley of the Western Union Telegraph Fortune, and who was a member of the NAACP, to buy her a house, sight unseen, on Millbank Street in the 19th ward. Dr. Young, who has been influential in this project, documented this in the paper, but also in numerous interviews with our team, where she described moving in the middle of the night, not bringing a moving truck to try to not attract attention, because they knew that there would be violence. And sure enough, the next morning, this horrific note was in their mailbox from the Klan, who attempted to burn down their home, but the Youngs refused to leave. For the next 17 years, Dr. Young stayed there. Dr. Young has asked me that when I share her story of fighting oppression, of integration and civil rights, that I mentioned the Bush family. They were the one white family on the street who allied with the Youngs, who stood with them in the 19th ward against the literally racial terrorism that was happening on that street, helping them stay there for the next 17 years. Dr. Irwin wants me to tell that story, not just because of her love for the Bush family, but because she says so often people try to say, you know, white people just didn't know better back in the 1950s. They were innocent. They just didn't know. When in fact, they voted for these policies. They helped enforce them through elections and through terror, through pressure and violence in their neighborhoods. Take a look at Rochester, front page of the paper. This is 1926. Over 8,000 Klansmen gathered at what is today East Rochester High School, burning 3 50-foot-high crosses. They would regularly meet at the Reynolds Arcade in downtown Rochester for their monthly meetings to institute their policies of white supremacy and barring people from certain communities. Another, an incredibly effective tool for enforcing racial segregation in Monroe County is something called a racially restrictive covenant. You'll notice the federal government codified these whites-only deeds in the National Housing Act in the 1930s, but it was something happening in Rochester well before the federal government did this. A few years ago, my students and I started researching racial covenants at the county clerk's office. Sadly, there is no digitized version of these, so we were on the microfilm. It was absolutely terrifying and not very fun until you started finding things. And it was kind of like a really racist treasure hunt. And we found tens of thousands of houses in Monroe County that on their deeds still to this day have clauses like this one saying that no person of the Caucasian race can legally own these homes. Tenants could take people to court and sue them, and police would evict folks who tried to break these racial covenants. They were incredibly effective. We partnered with City Roots Community Land Trust, a housing justice organization that does some really incredible work here in Rochester, whose board I serve on, as well as law students at the Yale Environmental Protection Clinic to help us with our research and to document some of the stories and names that we were finding on these deeds. We built a little Google Maps kind of site that soon will be a much more beautiful and incredible database on the website that the amazing team at RIT is building for our project, and as not just for our project, but for the community. It kind of overlays redlining, moments of civil rights, and these racial covenants. You'll notice the black spaces on here are places that were whites-only homes in Monroe County. And you'll notice the sort of barrier they form between the city and the suburbs, particularly here in Brighton and Irondequoit. And you can kind of go through on each, you can click, see the deed, the location on the microfilm where you can go find it. And oftentimes the advertisements in the paper advertising these deeds. So we started looking at these. And my students and I figured, you know, this is shocking. This is in Monroe County. We'd expect this in Mississippi, but not here. But maybe here who it is would be like kind of a fringe element. Maybe some of those Klansmen from the 20s, but not the leaders of Rochester, not the county executives or Kodak or people like that. But then we started looking at the names and signatures that created these deeds. And here's County Manager Clarence Smith, who signed this whites-only deed on hundreds of Monroe County homes that were tax foreclosures from Monroe County to ensure their future security and profit for the county. he put this on these loans, that no person of any race other than the Caucasian shall use or occupy these buildings or lots, saying that these restrictive covenants would continue in force forever unless modified by common consent. Really staggering. We found that the Kodak Corporation created the Kodak Employer Realty Corporation and ES&L Bank to construct over 300 homes in the town of Brighton. On a majority of these homes, Vice President Haight put this specific covenant that said the lot or dwellings should not be sold to or occupied by Black people in these neighborhoods. Recently, the neighbors of Meadowbrook, after some of this exposure that students of mine and community members, the students at Yale, them talking about it, getting publicized in the paper, let the community start to come together to organize and to get a certain percentage of neighbors to sign the correct documentation to have the county clerk add an anti-racist statement of welcome, renouncing this racist statement on the deed to create more welcome. My understanding, Meadowbrook, though, is still like 4 to 6% Black, majority white, as are most of these racial covenant neighborhoods. Like in East Irondequoit, where the Catholic Church and Bishop Francis O'Hearn actually put racist deeds like this one to make sure the church, the school, and convents attached would stay whites only. School districts like Gates at Thomas Edison School Number 4, the board members voted to put this specific restriction in 1941 that said this school could not be used by members of any race except the Caucasian. You'll see these all throughout Greece. Notice Italian and Jewish folks were often included. You can see the advertisements in the paper for these racial covenants out by Oak Hill in Pittsburgh, a neighborhood where today children are expected again to live 9 years less than a new redlined Clarissa Street area of the city. How many of you folks have been to Wegmans? I was at Wegmans today. One of the founders of Wegmans, Walter Wegman, and his wife actually put this whites-only deed on their home. They re-upped that deed when it expired to maintain the whites-onlyness of their property in Northwest Irondequoit. It was really something else. And they chose to do it, use the equity from their home to invest in their business and help build one of the biggest grocery empires in New York, right? There is no Black grocery empire in our community. Or Gates. Here's Norman Huck, president of the Builders Association. He partnered with his friend, Fred Drum, who was actually the president of the real estate board, to put hundreds of whites-only deeds on the homes they built. The president of the Bar Association, we found, did the same thing. I know I've gone overkill on covenants here. I could actually probably list quite a few more and quite a few more names. Example, the president of RIT at the time actually put these on his home. I mean, it was all over the place. But as always, from Austin Stewart of enslavement, to Howard Coles, Dr. Cooper and Helen Cooper, Dr. Young, people of color have always fought back. And one of the things my students and I found in our team was this amazing interview in the Rochester Voices Project from Reuben Davis. You can actually listen to him describe his experience fighting racial covenants in Rochester. I want to just play a very short clip. It is linked, so you should be able to hear it. He starts talking about this at about the 750-minute sound source here. But let me hit play just so you can hear his voice a little. And I haven't done this before, so Mead, if it's terrible, my apologies. But let's listen in.
Or in my own situation, my wife and I were looking for a house, and this was in 1958. We saw a house that we liked on Elmdorf Avenue in Rochester, which was just a block or so west of Genesee Street. And I would say that there probably were about 4 Black families who lived anywhere west of Genesee Street at that time. And we're talking something about 22 years ago, as recent. And the owner refused to sell to us because we were Black, and there was a restrictive covenant in the deed that these houses, when built, were not to be sold to the deed said coloreds and Italians. And the owner was an elderly lady who bought the house, and she could not understand that that provision in her deed, the restriction was no longer valid and enforceable. All she knew is that she couldn't sell to coloreds, as she said.
And strongly encourage you to take a look and listen a little bit more to some of that story. He goes on to describe how he fought back against it. Phone, can you give me, or me, can you give me a thumbs up if you can still hear me? I'm good, right? Okay, perfect. He goes on to describe how he fought back. You can actually see from the newspaper archive, this is the actual advertisement for the home in the time that he was trying to buy this home on Elmdorf Ave. I want you to notice Nothnagel, at the time Rochester's biggest realty firm, was helping that woman enforce this whites-only deed. In 1948, though, the Supreme Court and Shelley v. Kramer said these really were no longer enforceable, although they weren't really done away with until the Fair Housing Act of '68. And here we have Rochester's second Black lawyer, later first Black judge. You know, he knew the law, he knew the Supreme Court case. He's like, this shouldn't work. But Nothnagel won. The deed was still enforced. So he describes, he goes on in the interview, he says, I was active at the NAACP, and a white friend bought the house and transferred it to me. We had to go through those kinds of devious methods in order to find housing at the time. And I'll tell you, when my fourth graders heard Judge Davis's voice describing this story and the ways he worked around this racism to force his way into this neighborhood, and they were in awe. They wanted to tackle the problems that they saw in their school and community. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of these civic action projects my students have taken after learning about people like Judge Davis. I don't know what happened to this slide, but it just got crazy. But here's a link to sort of the whole map. I want to show you on here, and this is actually linked. This will be much prettier, but this is something that the students at Yale pulled together for us. But you can kind of go through all over the place. You can find the locations for the different deeds across Rochester. You can even see some of the newspaper advertisements, like this one advertising the whites only deeds. Here's actually the Elmdorf tract where, oops, I'm in trouble here, where Judge Davis's house was that he made his way into, right there in the 19th Ward. You can look it up. You can see the white friend that bought it and the transfer over to him, all documented in that Yale report. But again, I'll share in the chat in a minute here. There's a lot of things that can be done about these covenants. One, I think people need to own and admit these are on thousands of homes across Rochester. Having a public statement about this and a renunciation matters. I cannot imagine being a person of color trying to buy a house in Brighton or Pittsford or Penfield and seeing this there, realizing this is still a predominantly white neighborhood and that the neighbors could take this off their home and are choosing not to. You'll see the Bar Association locally has actually published a guide along with the Meadowbrook neighborhood for removing these off of deeds. And a lot of advocacy has been happening statewide to make it easier at a legislative level to take these off of homes and put in those statements of welcome or renunciations. So another thing I'm going to show you that just like covenants, just like redlining, speaks to systemic and really individual racism in the Rochester community. Something called blackface minstrel shows that speak to just how normalized and explicit and well known the racism in Rochester was. So often we hide behind this myth or false story that Rochester was incredibly progressive, always on the right side of history. The town of Douglas and Susan B. Anthony, right? So often leaving out the stories of racism at U of R or with George Eastman at Kodak, or what was happening in almost every school in Monroe County, something called a blackface minstrel show. We have found hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles publicizing, documenting, and celebrating these horrific statements of white supremacy and statements of who and who was not welcome at schools and in towns, as well as statements of who should and shouldn't be allowed to go to school, and what white kids should learn about Black children. Adults and kids dressed up in blackface like this. Notice 1960, the Honeyway Fall Times, they found this in the New York Historic Newspapers database, which is kind of clunky, but really cool for small local papers. This is again 1960, elementary school stage, explicit racist curriculum being taught about racism. These blackface minstrel shows often had main characters called N-men who would darken their faces with a bird cork, apparent on these like garish red lips. The main characters would be called Jim Crow, Sambo, just horrific. Frederick Douglass referred to the white people dressing up in blackface in his community back in the 1800s as the filthy scum of white society. And you can see some of those people that Frederick Douglass is talking about as the executive team of Kodak and GM, who would proudly publish these photos in their magazines and newspapers to kind of celebrate this. In 1939, Kodak actually got written up by the New York State Commission on the Urban Colored Population for having only 1 out of 16,000 employees be Black. You can see here the city school district participated, as did the Democrat and Chronicle, the return of old Black Joe, just celebrating these really just horrific acts. Or the Grease newspaper, 1950, proudly talking about the teacher, proving that grown-ups aren't the only ones that can blacken their faces to perform these racist shows. Pittsburgh, Catholic Church and Town Hall work together every year to put on their blackface show to make it clear who was not welcome. Brighton High School had their annual Licorice Lights on stage. Aquinas, you'll see the Allendale Private School in Pittsburgh. The Locust Club, the Rochester Police Union, had its annual blackface show. And as always, people of color fought back. So Reverend Quentin Primo, head of the NAACP at the time, he just integrated the town of East Irondequoit. His kids were going to this school. They just overcome a petition of almost 100 neighbors who had tried to prevent them from moving in. The bishop of the Episcopalian Church helped the Reverend Primo of St. Simon's buy the house, move in, and the Primos refused to leave. The kids found one of these blackface shows at their school, and so Primo and his friends started a campaign to end them. And they weren't successful until 1968. This letter to the editor and the DNC from 1961 really gets at what they saw so horrific here, saying these blackface shows must be banned from all public and private schools, churches, public buildings, saying to do otherwise will cripple permanently the attitudes of all white youth involved in these community-accepted shows towards the dark-skinned people of the world. Primo, his friends like Young, Cooper, they continued to fight. And when local leaders didn't listen, they reached out to the state. Governor Harriman responded with a report, the New York State Commission Against Discrimination in 1958. It shows us on a real granular level the way these racist policies, these shows, the education and systems in our community were creating inequity. Finding that in 1950, 80% of all Black folks lived in just 2 neighborhoods, the redlined 3rd and 7th wards. Finding that 30% of all units in these neighborhoods had no running water. You'll remember in the 30s, Howard Coles had found very similar numbers. You'll notice garbage pickup was worse in these neighborhoods, according to the report. Rat bites were a common occurrence for babies and small children, and actually were regularly reported in the Democrat and Chronicle. The report documents how not a single FHA or VA loan was given to any Black person in a Rochester suburb. That people like Constance Mitchell experienced this redlining firsthand, and Constance Mitchell actually became our first elected public official of color, I think the 2nd woman to ever be elected to office in Monroe County, and she ran because of redlining. She says in her oral history that we were living in a community bursting at the seams because there wasn't open housing. She says, when John and I bought our house in Gregg Street, the agent told us, I can't show you houses west of Jefferson Avenue. They're not open to Black people. So we were confined from Jefferson Avenue back to the river to look for a place on the west side of the city. It took her 2 tries to get elected. She finally won. On her first day, the Democratic minority leader, Alvin Grossman, actually called her the N-word. There was no women's bathroom in the county office building because women had never been elected before. You can see her and her peers here. She was incredible. She actually taught herself shorthand. She would document everything that happened and then bring the minutes home and share them with all of her friends in her living room every night. They would go through them, they would strategize, and then show up as a community to these supervisor meetings, demanding an end to some of the injustice that was happening. Folks like the Bias family also resisted. Their story documented in this report. A dentist, a hospital administrator, these 2 bought a house in Irondequoit, but neighbors threw rocks through their windows. They faced all kinds of terror. This was 1964, actually before the uprising. So they sold their home. They tried to buy a house in Henrietta to be close to the Coopers in that sort of solidarity, their NAACP friends, but not before. The developer of Gatehouse Trail refused to sell to them, so they sued at the state level and actually won the right to own that home in Henrietta. Or Ellen Stubbs, 1963, she helped integrate the town of Greece. After being denied a home, she found a white friend of the same economic background to go, and they were told there's 5 homes available. Ellen Stubbs went right after and was told there are 0 options. She sued and she won. There are so many different stories like Ellen Stubbs, but there are also stories not just of resistance in moving and suing, in fighting racial covenants. There's resistance through community, through joy, through art. Today in the DNC, Idonia Owens talked about growing up in these neighborhoods and how people didn't lock their doors, how these neighborhoods, despite the racism, despite the federal disinvestment, people came together as a community. They looked out for each other's kids. It was tight knit. There's an amazing database that some of you may know of through the University of Rochester, if I'm correct, called Jazz Chester, that documents Rochester's jazz history and community. Places like Chef Paradise and the Fifth Odd Club, incredible photographs of Black folks, local and national musicians, dancing, performing, coming together, really even in integrated spaces to just survive, to fight back, to resist, and to create space for joy as its own act of rebellion in a time where schools were celebrating these minstrel shows, right? Meanwhile, in these neighborhoods, things are getting bad. Like what I said earlier about 30% of homes still not having running water, incredible amounts of overcrowding. Often 5 families are sharing one single family home, 1 bathroom for 5 families, 1 kitchen for 5 families, or instead of a bathroom, just an outhouse in the city outside that's being shared with an apartment. So the city had a choice of what do we want to do here? Do we invest in better housing? Or do we kind of institute a process of removal? The federal government gave Rochester over $30 million for, instead of removal, they called it urban renewal, which also included a ton of highway construction, like 490 in the inner loop. And men like Elmer Milliman on the left, president of Central Trust Bank, John Gall over at the city, presided over a plan that didn't allow Black folks like Howard Coles, who tried to get on these public committees, access because of their skin color. And they institute a policy of raising many of these Black neighborhoods. In the Red Line's 7th Ward, 886 families were forced from their homes. In the 3rd Ward in the early 60s through the end of the 60s, over 850 Black families were forcibly removed from their homes. And where could they go? As the inner loop came through these neighborhoods, as Black stores and jazz spaces were demolished, they couldn't move to the suburbs. They couldn't move to the 19th Ward unless they were, someone of means and just incredible friendships like Dr. Young had. Instead, they packed into streets like Jefferson Avenue on the boundaries of these red lines neighborhoods. American Panorama actually documents some of this. They don't have the full data yet for Rochester that the DNC and some of our other archives have, but you can actually look in and see some of the federal reports and see the displacements that happened in each of Rochester's projects. What's fascinating that I learned from this is the Southeast Loop that was most recently filled in was the last part to get built. It demolished the Savannah Street neighborhood, which was a predominantly Black neighborhood. And instead of building new housing like was promised, a just giant vacant lot stayed in its place until the early 80s when Strong Museum was able to snap up that property for a steal and build this huge tourist spot that I loved going to as a kid, but never realized that it was built on what had been a thriving Black neighborhood and a red line space in Rochester. So you can look at almost every city and see some of this, some really incredible data in there that documents some of the stuff going on with the highways, the projects, the people who oversaw it, and a lot more work needs to be done on some of that. Urban renewal, though, also leads to issues in policing, as does redlining, right? So people are packing in, they're getting displaced from their homes. It's disrupting communities, it's disrupting relationships. It's not as safe to lock your door when all of a sudden you don't know who your neighbors are and you've been moved across town, not by your choice. And the city had a choice. Are we going to fund housing? Are we going to fund schools, integration, or are we going to fund a policy of containment? And the city dramatically increased its police force and started a policy of containment to keep people of color in these red line neighborhoods. Whereas the banks were having a little bit more trouble in the 60s with this, the police were brought in to help increase the containment. And this led to friction. Lots of high profile instances, like here, Rufus Fairwell, locking up a gas station he managed on Plymouth and Columbia, right across the street, the river from the U of R. There's still a corner store there. He's locking up and the police arrest him. He shows them the key. He's like, this is my store. They're like, nope, you're robbing it. He's like, I'm not. He talks back. He gets handcuffed, brought downtown, brutally beaten within an inch of his life. He had to use a wheelchair for mobility because of the injuries he received. But instead of backing down, Farewell got his community together. Reverend Gibson and Annie Zion, and he led a protest at the steps of City Hall to protest what had happened to Farewell, to demand transparency and justice. An image that looks just like Rochester in the summer and fall of 2020 after instances like George Floyd or Daniel Prude. And what street was it that Daniel Prude was killed in police custody? It was Jefferson Avenue, one of those red line streets, much like where Rufus Farewell had his incident. Because of these stories like Farewell, A.C. White, a number of other cases, people like Dr. Martin Luther King came to Rochester. People like Malcolm X came and spoke to packed houses at like Baden Street Settlement House. But it wasn't enough. As the Great Migration continued, as more and more migrants are moving into the city and local leaders, white leaders, refused to act, an uprising, rebellion, or what many have called a revolution, took place. This has often been called a riot as well. On a hot summer night in July '64, people decided they had had enough. Over 1,000 Black folks were arrested. It lasted over 3 days. 1,500 National Guard troops were called in to quell the protest. Many of the protest was nonviolent. Some was violent, particularly targeting white landlords and businesses that had been discriminatory to the Black community. County historian Carolyn Backett documents the cause of this uprising is directly linked to that urban renewal, to the redlining, the lack of running water, and the public safety issues that were happening in these neighborhoods, which was also compounded by school segregation. Black children were forced to go to only a few schools in the city of Rochester. Take a look at School 33, a school that's over 90% Black and Latinx today in my neighborhood of Beechwood. At the time, though, it was pretty much 100% white. I think 4% of the students maybe were Italian at the time. Notice this map that the NAACP Education Committee helped force the city school district to create. It documents how in these neighborhoods, the percentage of non-white students. So look at School 46 in the Browncroft neighborhood. This was one of those green line neighborhoods. It had whites only covenants on the homes, and their school in the 60s was still 0% students of color. Or look at School 43. Whereas if you go to the red line neighborhoods, your School 9, School 3, School 4, over 90% of those students were Black. Today at those schools, over 90% of those students are Black. There was a massive push by NAACP and local leaders to end this segregation. They got about a year or so of integration. Justin Murphy actually published an excerpt from his book in the Democrat and Chronicle literally today, documenting some of this story and including the part of the story that is really terrifying, the organization of the white community to protest successfully against school integration. Hundreds of Black students start going to these all-white schools like Charlotte High School. And every day as they entered on their bus, they were met by mobs of hundreds of white parents, like this one, led by Mary Nicolisi, throwing rocks and stones, hoarding puppets on nooses that were Black outside of the schools, terrorizing these students, bricks going through windows, glass flying on the buses. It was absolutely horrific. Well reported in the DNC, a number of oral histories. Photographs like this one, over 1,000 white parents marching down Main Street at the War Memorial. School board member Louis Cerulli, whose School 34 is actually still named for, led a giant rally encouraging white children and parents to be militant and even violent in their protest against integrated schools. A year later, they won, but not before Black students like these at the Charlotte Black Student Union organized for their right to a safe, equal, and integrated education. Sadly, these youth lost, but their resistance and willingness to fight, I think, really matters and is important to be told. The final piece I want to touch on is a policy that's not of the past. It's a policy that is still on the books in pretty much all of Rochester's suburbs, something called exclusionary zoning. So in the 60s in New York State, it became harder to discriminate explicitly based on race. But back then and today, it is still 100% legal to discriminate based on income and wealth. So whites-only town boards like this one in Penfield, They responded to hundreds of neighbor complaints from white doctors, lawyers, community members who said, we do not want Black folks moving in our community. Let's discriminate based on class. Let's price them out. So they created harsh codes to make lot sizes bigger, to make what was built bigger and more expensive, upzoning all over the place to make it so that affordable housing, apartments, townhouses were incredibly difficult to build. And that's why Penfield today is actually #1 in the country for school segregation. We've been working with some amazing students at the U of R. This was Ben Schiffman, one of Dr. Stu Jordan's students. He's been going into county archives and town archives. If you went here in Pittsburgh, and he has been digitizing these zoning maps, documenting how Pittsburgh had almost no zoning back in the 30s to the 50s, significant zoning to price people out, up to the 60s, where massive amounts of Pittsburgh land is reserved to be AAA, so that only the most wealthy can live there. Pittsburgh is not Rochester's most wealthy suburb, or a suburb where people are expected to live 9 years longer by accident. It was by design. Redlining, covenants, and then zoning. Zoning that is still on the books to this day. Dr. Jordan at the U of R pulled together this really cool resource to document some of the zoning in these communities. We hope for this to be included in our big website that Whitney Spariza and her team at RIT are creating. Dr. Jordan writes this, though, to help you understand what zoning does today. He says, of the land area on which the town government allows residence, here's Brighton, about 88% is reserved for single-family homes. So why can't Monroe County's lower income households find a place to live in Brighton? Because the Brighton town government makes it illegal, just like Pittsburgh's and Penfield's and Webster's, to build more affordable types of housing on almost all of the town's land. He's got this really neat graphic that he created with ArcGIS that kind of goes through and shows what's happening in these towns. We're hoping to build these for absolutely every town in the area, so that we can see a fuller picture of exclusion in our community and where and what. Students who look at this might decide that that's something that they want to change. They're also building a map like this one. This is an early prototype of what they've been building. This shows all the zoning in Monroe County. You'll notice the lighter spaces are those single family, highly expensive lots, especially on the east side. You can see the majority of that land is documented this way. Someone, David, you are muted, that would be great, thank you. And they also have identified high potential areas where there's bus stops and areas closer for people to actually, where affordable housing would be good places to happen and where zoning changes could happen. Again, not as prescriptive, but as something for town leaders, for students, for teachers and community members to have a more informed conversation about what they might do to make their town more equitable. We're hoping to document these amazing things like frequency of bus pickups, bus routes, and how zoning and changes in zoning might lead to equity when it comes to transportation. And this is a fight that's long been going on. It's not just Dr. Jordan and his incredible students at U of R. It's people like Robert Rhodes, one of the first Black people to own a home in Pittsburgh, 1968, president of the NAACP. He describes what Pittsburgh was doing with its new zoning change as the new racial covenants, saying that enacting the success of zoning would hasten the day when we will be a divided community on our way to self-destruction. Maybe a community like Common Ground Health has found that today a child born in a red line area lives 9 years less than a child in this exclusively zoned Pittsburgh community. This is something we are allowing. It's something, though, that people have always fought, and that it's my invitation to you to consider what it might look like to work for equity. We want to do this, though, in an informed way. We have an incredible team of folks working on this project from U of R, RIT, folks in the community. Whitney Spariza, Brendan Thompson have done some really amazing work in pulling some of this together, trying to represent what students and teachers are part of the project have talked about that would be helpful tools for some of this stuff. You can see just really early prototype stuff of this space-based portal into racism and resistance in Rochester, New York. We're hoping to have some early stuff this spring for people to explore, but I wanted to give you just a little bit of a taste. We're also hoping that moments of racial unrest and of anti-racism could be highlighted on these maps so students can see this in the curriculum, and then they can go onto these maps and locate it in geography and in community. So to kind of close, because of these racist policies, right, we remain one of the most segregated communities in the country, whether it's schooling, whether it's location, whether it's housing, whether it's inequity in income, poverty, home ownership, ELA proficiency, math proficiency, you name it, health outcomes, asthma rates, COVID-19, the data is stark. And things will not change unless we live out these words from James Baldwin, who says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And it's my invitation to all of you today to join me in attempting to have the courage to face this racism head on, the way Austin Stewart did when enslavement was the law of the land in New York State, the way Howard Coles did with his newspaper calling out redlining, the way Dr. Young challenged the Klan, the Coopers integrated Henrietta, Judge Davis fought Nothnagel and the racial covenant on his deed, and was brave enough to record his words at the public library to live on as a story of resistance to encourage folks in our community today. The way people like Robert Rhodes and Rufus Fairwell challenged policing, exclusionary zoning. There are so many things. The folks at the Python and Shep's Paradise who came together despite the inequity to experience joy and art and music and say, we will not be erased, we will not go away. This is our community and we love where we live and we're going to fight for it. And it's my hope that if we love a place the way I love Rochester, that we can own the good and we can own the bad. The Frederick Douglasses and the Louis Cerulis, right? The Howard Coleses and the ESL banks that participated in this in the past. We have to own the story, move forward, and create systemic change to do it. And we have to do it with the facts and take those steps toward anti-racist action. So I just talked for a long time. I showed a ton of stuff. Before we open it up for conversation, I just want everyone to just to take a good minute and a half, open up the chat on your computer. And I would love it if you would just share a feeling that's coming up for you. We do this with kids. Just take a deep breath. What feelings are coming up for you? What questions are you having? What was something that you learned or something that surprised you? And any thoughts that you have about what this history means for you and for your community to move towards equity in our community, owning and understanding some of this history. We are the county of Clarence Smith, racial covenants, and of Constance Mitchell, with fighting it through elections, through law, through policy change. Where are you at? And so before anyone hits enter, I want you to take a minute to type and I'll count us down and we'll all hit enter at the same time. We call this a waterfall. So again, don't hit enter. Take a full minute just to type any reactions, feelings, things that surprised you, or reflections and questions that you have in the chat. And then we'll open it up for a little bit of discussion and some Q&A, and then close with some action steps and things that we can do to move forward. So go ahead, take a minute, but again, don't hit enter. And feel free to respond to one of these prompts on the screen. Take about 20 more seconds. All right, let's all hit enter in 3, 2, 1, enter. With some feelings coming up, some outrage, some sadness, some maybe embarrassment, some outrage, learning that your neighborhood in Irondequoit may have had enslaved people working in orchards, That Rogers Orchard area, all those homes actually majority have racially restrictive covenants in that Rogers tract over by the elementary school. I don't know. How do we have some pride for our neighborhood, but also own some of that difficult piece? How prevalent and pervasive these issues were. Feels like it's a long time ago, and yet we see so much of this today. Some local connection to Nothnagel and family there. Thanks for sharing that, Terrence. The covenants were relics that couldn't be enforced, but knowing people used them for quite a while and did try to enforce them. Kind of new forms of redlining with zoning. Some thanks for some of this message, some rage, some frustration, that these things happen in your neighborhoods and in places in your community. Well, thank you so much for kind of listening into some of this story. Before I kind of open it up for some discussion and sharing, I want to again share the link to my slides and the resources that I shared, as well as a chance for you to register for the Anti-Racist Education Conference. If you're a community member, teacher, professor, or parent, you're invited to attend and learn how we can make sure this kind of history is being taught across Monroe County, that our schools and teachers have the courage and support of their community to teach this hard and uncomfortable stuff, so that hopefully your children and our community, children across our community, won't be adults not knowing this history or having the chance to talk about what it means and how we do something about some of these problems. And so again, I want to leave us with these questions. Would love to open it up for folks to share any other feelings coming up, things that surprised you, and your thoughts or questions, and what this history means for you in your role and for you in your community. So feel free to share a question in the chat, or you feel free to unmute. I will invite folks though to share the air. We're not looking for too long of a comment. I'll cut you off, but please keep it short and thoughtful, and we'd really love to hear your questions, comments, or reflections on some of this history. And Mead, was there anything else that you wanted us to think about before we move into this session, this section of the talk?
You already advertised the conference that I was going to otherwise plug, so that's one step done. The only other thing I would take a moment to shamelessly promote some Mellon programming. If you're interested in more programming like this, and just generally interested in updates about the Mellon Digital Humanities program, I will paste our email list registration link into the chat. You can also follow us on Twitter at URMellonDH. I will paste a link to that as well. We have another DigiTalk planned by Professor Kante Kaliskan at the U of R with the Georgian Institute for Data Science on March 17th at 3. And then we will also have our end of the year conference from May 5th through 6th on downstream navigating polluted media currents. So please sign up for our email list, follow us on Twitter, and you can keep apprised of these events. But I am so excited to get into the discussion, so I will stop here.
Thanks, Steve. So again, feel free to share a question or comment in the chat, or feel free to unmute. And let's get into it. Yeah, Larry?
Regarding the covenants.
Yeah.
I'm assuming the covenants themselves are not legal anymore, I would hope.
Nope.
But is there any movement at the state level to require those covenants to be struck from the deeds?
There have been a few proposals that have not come out of committee, largely because the real estate and building associations have really pushed hard against it. They've kind of said, this is old news. It's still on the deed, but it's not hurting anybody on the deed. And it's going to be an extra step or burden in our process for selling and purchasing homes. A lot of folks, though, have challenged that. And you can see in the YAL report, which I think I have linked, but let me make sure it's in the chat. They talk about some of the things that can be done and some of the specific policies to advocate for. I know locally, Jamie Romeo, Harry Bronson, some of those folks, there have been conversations around that. But not necessarily as much movement as maybe we'd like to see with some larger shifts. Because despite it no longer being enforceable after the Fair Housing Act and Shelley v. Kramer, they're still there and they're still on the deeds.
Oh yeah, it's a real shame in our community that we still have this. I agree.
Oh yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, Larry. And I think the other part of the shame is how hidden it still is. So many of these neighborhoods know. This report was in the DNC, it was in city newspaper, the maps were published, people know it's in their neighborhood. And they're choosing not to tell their children, yeah, a black person couldn't have lived in this neighborhood until 1968. Not just because of federal law, but because the people in this neighborhood put these whites only covenants on their deeds. And this is something that happened. It could happen again. And we want to tell the truth about this and talk about what we're going to do as a family and as a community to make sure that these things don't happen. I mean, you go to Germany, right? And you've got the stumbling stones, monuments all over the place that reflect what happened in the Holocaust, that say this should not happen again. We did this as a community. We have to own this and make sure it doesn't. We have to teach the fullness of it. And you've seen across the community how many schools there's been real parent pushback and teacher pushback to the idea of some of this stuff being taught in classrooms, because it might make white children feel kind of sad or guilty or uncomfortable. And I'll tell you what, I felt sad learning this history. I felt uncomfortable learning it. But as adults, we have a choice to inspire our children and our community to say, yeah, it's okay to feel sad about these things, but you didn't do it, right? It's not your fault, but it is part of your story. And we get to decide as a community what we're going to do to it. And we want to have the courage to talk about it, to wrestle with it, and to figure out how we move forward. So I don't know, I think it's the legislation and it's the stories we tell, and then it's those larger curriculum changes I think are going to be really, really important. So I would encourage folks to reach out to your school board and ask them if they're teaching our curriculum. Are they teaching the really great work that's come out of U of R and the BOCES called the Race, Class, and Inequities Project that documents some of this history, and would encourage you to ask your school board and superintendent, hey, this is really important to me. Are you teaching this? How many students are learning it? What grade levels are they learning it? That matters so much, because there are folks right now emailing and attending school board meetings demanding that we whitewash our history, banning books, banning memory, and I think that is troubling. So want to encourage folks to take that step. Who else? I see one of our advisory board members, David Hirsch, has a hand raised. David, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking, how can we share this with other folks and share our accomplishments and also difficulties? I'm so excited about the stuff we're doing. So I was one that entered in that I was just excited, and I want to do as much as I can about this, and I want to be able to share it with others. Will that be able to be shared on your website? Will people be able to share across projects and learn from each other that way? And we could have not one project, but many projects going on in the Rochester area?
That's our hope. For us, everything is free and open source. We want people to use it, adapt it, build on it, make their own things. We want this story to be out there. That's part of why we've been working with professors and students at RIT and U of R to build a website that won't be owned by Pat Stone, that will be owned by the community. It's been funded by ESL and a number of the other foundations, some of whom participated in these policies of the past, to make sure that it's out there and can be in conversation with other projects that are happening. So I think that's going to be really important.
This is so exciting.
And you can share anything that I've shared with you in the chat. All of our curriculum is linked from grade 4 around enslavement, redlining, to grade 5, Latinx, civil rights, urban renewal, and youth protests against it, and protests for bilingual education, to more in-depth stories for 8th and 12th graders around the freedom struggle and justice struggles in Rochester. I see a question in the chat from Justin asking, can you speak more about the issue of racial displacement around the inner loop? Are there related concerns about the housing being erected in wake of the removal project? Justin, that is a really, really good question. So what you're getting at is you have this inner loop that was constructed in the 50s and 60s in different stages. that in part was incentivized by the federal government because it was going to separate the redlined or black neighborhoods, as well as destroying parts of those neighborhoods. The president of the American Highway Association referred to this massive 1956 highway bill that got passed as a way for cities to remove their black neighborhoods. He used a quite explicit and different term, and he publicly and regularly used it. As one of the architects and chief lobbyists, like FDR's vice president actually talked about how highway construction would be a really great way to get rid of these black slum neighborhoods, as he called them. There's a really good Evan Dawson Connections in 1370 from last year, where me and my friend Mary Kearney, who lived where Strong Museum is today, she moved here in the Great Migration as a child, and then very quickly her neighborhood, which she loved, where no doors were locked, was torn down to make way for the inner loop and urban renewal. And she, on Evan Dawson, talks a lot about what has now been constructed in her neighborhood, which is called the neighborhood of play. And it's a ton of apartments, apartments that aren't really family friendly oftentimes, apartments that are very expensive. There's some affordable housing that's built in, but it's concerning, especially to folks like Mary who lived there that weren't consulted at all about what got put in. Activists and artists like Sean Dunwoody have tried to take a more direct approach, I think, with the northern section of the loop near Scio and the public market. And there's a really strong contingent of neighbors who all of a sudden will be reconnected to downtown Rochester. And they're terrified that their neighborhood is going to get gentrified because all of a sudden all this new stuff is going to get built right there in a massive investment. And unless the city is really careful about how they do some of this and make sure that these neighbors and neighborhoods are protected, we're going to see some significant issues and concern, like I think we have in some parts of the inner loop over there. So there's a lot there, and I'll share in a second, Justin, in the chat, the link to that document. And then there was a recent documentary, like 10 minutes, about Rochester's inner loop that features Sean Dunwoody and talks about this. It's on Twitter. I gotta find it. I'll put it in the chat for you in a minute. So don't leave, Justin, until I share that one. Who else? What other questions or comments are coming up for folks?
David, do you have another question, or is your hand up from last time? Just checking.
Here's that Evan Dawson interview with Mary. It's really good to hear. Elizabeth asks, how long have we been working on this project? And can we say something about the long-term effects on students? So I personally have been doing this for almost 10 years, really just in my 4th grade classroom originally, because a 4th grader asked me if Martin Luther King came to Rochester. And she asked, did civil rights happen here? And I was like, I have no idea. I grew up in Webster. I was never taught this history. I never even had a black teacher. I sat by maybe 3 black friends the entire time I went to school. I have no idea, but I'll look into it. And that was part of my journey. Because of that, looking into, I got involved with organizations like City Roots Land Trust, the RMAPI, Connected Communities, the Beechwood Neighborhood Coalition. And that's how I started meeting many of these civil rights leaders, many of these just ordinary folks who were marchers and protesters. As I heard their stories, I would document them, bring them back to my students. Slowly, I'd bump into a database or a collection of different things. We'd find people to go with, like the Youth at Teen Empowerment, and just slowly built it out. Each year teaching a little more to my students. Along the way, the Youth at Teen Empowerment, after they learned about it, they demanded that the social studies director at RCSD do something about this. And they invited us to come do some trainings. It was just a volunteer project then. Got to meet amazing teachers like Keisha James, who helped us get this project funded and be something that we're doing full time for the next several years, to be able to hire teachers to write curriculum and run professional development. And that's been really amazing. To talk more though about the impact on students, we're in over half the local school districts where some teachers have been engaged. It's not mandatory though in all of those districts, which is why calling is so important, and making your voice heard if this is something that you think should be taught. But the other big impact, although several thousand kids learned this last year and the year before across the county, the other big impact and reason I do this more than anything is about 4 years ago or so. As I was teaching this unit to my class, teaching them about Dr. Young and redlining, I started asking my kids at the end of every unit, what problems do you see in our community today that you want to address? And what strategies from people of the past might you be able to use to challenge these things? And a girl in my class who's Black said, Mr. Wiegand, I really like you, but it's not fair that I've never had a Black teacher or a teacher who looks like me. And there's not a single Black teacher in our school in Henrietta. I think that's systemic racism and I want to fight it. And I was like, all right. And she's like, well, let's talk to the principal. And I was like, well, we could talk to the principal. I just got tenure, but maybe we should think a little bit more. What did Dr. Young do? And she said, well, she got her friends to help her, like Mrs. Sibley and the bushes on her street. And so she got 2 friends, Simra and Bailey. They came together. We got parent permission. We met every day at lunch, did some research, found that we had 11 Black teachers in Henrietta, 550 white teachers. We found that our 11 Black teachers in Henrietta was more than all the Black teachers in Pittsford, Penfield, Fairport, and Webster combined. And that's pretty much still the case today. And the girls documented it. They made some graphs. They met with the principal, wrote him a sweet little note asking to have lunch, and said they had some things to share. And they shared. And that guy wasn't ready for it. I mean, he was like, whoa. They were like, have you ever interviewed a Black person and not hired them? And he was like, yeah. And they were like, why? And he's like, let's bring you in to talk to the assistant superintendent and the school board. And the girls did. And it led to policy change in Henrietta and an increase in teachers of color being hired, relationships being built with historically Black colleges in places like Atlanta, so that these students have a teacher who looks like them, that they deserve by the time they graduate, was key. There are so many stories like that, though, of where when a kid sees someone who looks like themselves from their community, who is just an ordinary person like many of us, they realize they can be a part of creating change, and they do. And that's why I think this is so important. And that to me is some of the biggest impact that continues to happen on students as they look at these issues and also start to think of things not just as individual problems, but as a system. I don't think our principal or school district in Henrietta are out with ill intentions or are trying to be racist, but their hiring policy was leading to inequity in hiring. And the kids had a language to describe that. It wasn't my idea at all. It was these kids, 9-year-olds' idea. Imagine if our community owned our history. We saw ordinary people like Dr. Young and Howard Coles and so many others as people that we could be like. I think a lot of change could happen. I see a question in the chat from Robert. You spoke about the people who were displaced into smaller areas, but how large was the Black exodus from Rochester after urban renewal, and where did they go? So Robert, I wouldn't say there was an exodus. I would just say there was an exodus from kind of one block to another block. In particularly, many folks like Mary Kearney, she was displaced from where Strong Museum is, and she ended up over on Jefferson Avenue. Jefferson Avenue was one of the most common places. In her oral history for the Public Library Voices Project, if you look up Olga Edwards, she was Rochester's first Black librarian. She lived in an apartment on Jefferson Ave, which at the time, in the early 50s, early 60s, was 100% white pretty much. She described urban renewal happening in the 7th Ward. Like, where the Coca-Cola factory got built, or the Pepsi factory, that used to be Black and Latinx neighborhoods. Those folks got pushed over to Jefferson, but there weren't enough apartments. So white people who really, struggled in that area too, because of federal policies, they couldn't improve their properties because of redlining, right? But they could get a loan to buy a house in Penfield or Webster through the FHA. And they could subsidize it too by taking their houses, maybe 1,200 square foot homes on Jefferson Ave, and chop them into 5 apartments, just hanging up sheets or little dividers and packing 5-6 families in. Olga Edwards describes this process and just how horrific it was, the overcrowding. There are a few other places like that. Some of the yellow line neighborhoods started to fill with more folks of color, which is part of why in Rochester today, you can see a place like Cornhill. Parts of Cornhill are much whiter because of the gentrification that happened with urban renewal. Whereas you start to spread out a little bit more, some of those areas like the Lyle Otis area was 100% white, but it was Italian and Jewish, so it got redlined. And today it's predominantly Black and Latinx, right? So that's some of your question there, Robert. And eventually after the 60s, more folks started trying to make their way out into the suburbs or into outer parts of the city. As white flight happened more and more in the 60s, there was more availability and space for people to rent. And that was part of that story too. But then it totally devalued those properties because of how it happened. It wasn't well planned and thought out. And that's why that data point I showed you at the beginning, not just about home ownership being a huge gap, white and Black in our community, but the value of the homes. White homes are almost twice the value in Monroe County than homes that are owned by Black folks, according to Rochester. So it's rooted in this kind of stuff. They made it illegal, but they didn't do anything to fix it or repair the harm that was done. And I'm excited for what our students and hopefully folks like yourself will do to think about some of those things. So I know we're at time, Mead. I'd be happy to answer any other questions. Again, my email is on that link that I shared at the beginning. Would love to connect with any of you and talk more about some of this history. Please feel free, again, to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat, and I'll turn it back over to Mead for any last thoughts.
I think the only last thought I have is just we so appreciate you sharing this truly like revelatory history with us, and I think I can speak for most of us in saying that it just lends a greater appreciation to the forces that shape the city in which we live. And that's just around us all the time. I also really appreciate your emphasis on how each of us, may be uniquely situated in our own ways to intervene. So I look forward to seeing what those kinds of interventions look like as well. If you want more like this, register for the 2022 Greater Rochester Antiracist Education Conference. And we'll also have more Mellon programming. We'd love to see you there. Thank you so much for everyone who turned out this evening. And thank you, Shane, very much.
Thanks for having me, everyone.